Now, Portugal has opened its embassy in Kenya, marking a new phase in diplomatic relations between Nairobi and Lisbon. Speaking at the inauguration ceremony that took place in Rwanda, Foreign Affairs Permanent Secretary Macharia Kamau termed the diplomatic move as a cement to the cordial relations that Kenya and Portugal have enjoyed that dates back 500 years ago. Present at the Thursday event were the Portuguese ambassador and the Portuguese Foreign Affairs Minister Santos Silva, who pointed out that Portugal is maximizing on the new wave of relations between Europe and Africa.
It is a great day for both Portugal and Kenya, a day where Portugal is inaugurating its embassy here in Kenya, and we are privileged to have His Excellency, the Portugal Foreign Affairs Minister, Santos Silva, with me here. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us on KTN News.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yes. Portugal, speaking of 1500, that is about 500 years here in Kenya, dating back to history. And Portugal is one of the oldest states, foreign states in Kenya. Why have we experienced a little bit lukewarm presence of Portugal here in Kenya?
Well, we owe a lot to Kenya because it was here in the contemporary, in what is contemporarily Kenya, in the kingdom of Malindi, that Vasco da Gama found the pilot that took him to India in 1498. So we owe it a lot to you. There is a very important Portuguese heritage here in the coastal Kenya, and we have excellent relationships in bilateral terms. Portugal and Kenya actually are working together, co-organizing the second United Nations Conference on Oceans. We had here last year the conference on the blue economy, and we shall have next June in Lisbon the World Conference on Oceans. So you see that we have an agenda, a common agenda.
From Lisbon, Portugal to Nairobi, Kenya, what do we expect to get, or the kind of relationship between Kenya and Portugal moving forward now that you are relaunching, inaugurating your embassy here in Kenya officially?
Several things. First of all, in bilateral terms, I think we can expect an increase of our trade and economic relations. They are going well. They doubled if you compare the figures of 2018 with the figures 4 years before. They doubled. But still, they are lower. They are lower than they could be. So, first of all, let's improve our trade relations. Secondly, there is some important investment of Portuguese companies here in Kenya. For instance, we have this Portuguese company that is doing the program for computers for young students in your schools. We have companies that are working, building up and maintaining your roads. We have IT companies. In fact, since last spring, we have a Portuguese Business Council. So I think also in terms of investment, we can expect more in the years to come in what regards our bilateral relations. Thirdly, and not less important, we are partners in the fight against terrorism. Kenya plays a very important role here in the eastern part of Africa, because it is a very stable country, because it is a country that is very determined in fighting against terrorism, Al-Shabaab and other kinds of terrorism. Sure. And Portugal makes part of the international coalition against terrorism, because you know that is one the most important threats to our security, to our way of living, to the well-being of our populations. And fourth, you can see by what we are doing in terms of the oceans agenda that in multilateral terms, Kenya and Portugal converge, for instance, in the United Nations, defending practically always the same positions.
Very few countries in Africa speak Portuguese. We can mention them, probably Angola, Mozambique, about 6 of them. So which measures are you putting in place to penetrate probably through Kenya to East Africa and Africa at large, as Portugal?
First of all, let's look to the demographics. The Portuguese language is among the 3 languages that are more rapidly growing in the world, the UNESCO says. For instance, here in Africa, right now, there are more than 50 million people speaking Portuguese. Portuguese is perhaps the 3rd or the 4th most spoken language in Africa. But if you see the projections until the end of this century, well, by the end of this century, more than 300 million people will speak Portuguese in Africa. Nowadays, 80% of the Portuguese speakers live in Brazil. By the end of the century, the majority of the Portuguese speakers will live in Africa because of the expansion, the demographic growth of Angola and Mozambique mainly. But of course, Portuguese has an utility, is a useful language for economy, for international contacts, for communication. So we are expanding the teaching of Portuguese in non-speaking Portuguese countries. For instance, in Kenya, we have a cooperation with the University of Nairobi. There is Portuguese studies in the University of Nairobi. We are right now training some Kenyan diplomats in Portuguese competences, and this is a main goal of our foreign policy, to expand the teaching of the Portuguese worldwide.
We've just concluded the ICPD 25 conference at KICC. What has been the contribution of Portugal to this summit and to Kenya at large, now that it has been hosted here in Kenya?
Well, the contribution of Kenya was absolutely critical because you were the co-organizers in collaboration with Denmark and the United Nations, of course. The participation of Portugal was at a very high rank because we were represented by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I participated in a panel on youth. Why? Because Portugal organized the first World Conference of Ministers of Youth in 1908, and then 21 years later we organized the second World Conference this year in Lisbon. And that was the first Conference of Ministers of Youth in which an explicit reference to issues of reproductive health was made. If you want to fight if you want to have success in the fight against, for instance, infant mortality, maternal mortality, if you want to give all the people the information they need to have their sexuality in a good way, you have to invest in youth. It's very, very important to work with youngsters. It is very, very important to include in the curriculum, for instance, of the secondary school, themes that prepare youngsters to make their choices for a responsible family life. That's all that matters.
That was your contribution. Speaking of the youth, I've just gone through the speech that you presented at the University of Nairobi. It was a beautiful speech, and I don't know how will Kenyan youth benefit from the ties between Portugal and Kenya?
Well, I would dare to say that the most important role that Portugal can play is the role of a key role, a role of a mediator, of a bridge builder between Europe and Africa. We are very used to Africa, we are very close to Africa, and we think that we understand Africa. Why? Because we don't lecture the Africans. Instead, we try to learn from the Africans and we try to learn with the Africans. And this attitude is very, very important nowadays in Europe. For instance, in last year, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, announced it in the European Parliament what he called, rightly, in my opinion, a new alliance between Europe and Africa on jobs, growth and investment. This is very, very important, and we have to implement this alliance. But to implement it, we have to build it together. It's not a question of the Europeans telling the Africans what they have to do or what they may do. It's a question of Europeans and Africans work together to implement a framework of cooperation that could be mutually beneficial for Europeans, for European companies, for European countries, for European institutions, and beneficial for African people, for African companies, for African economy. And we have now a very, very important opportunity, and we cannot waste that opportunity, which is your agreement, the constitution here in Africa of the Continental Free Trade Area. This is a process of economic integration in the whole of the Africa that is very parallel with the process of European integration, the process that turned into the constitution of a single market in Europe. So we have to seize this opportunity in order to scale up the economic relations between Africa and Europe, but in a more balanced way. Right now they are still very unbalanced, and harming Africa. We have to rebalance them.
Finally, one will ask, after all those years, like I stated earlier, experiencing a little bit lukewarm presence of the Portugal in Kenya and all that, what has made you rethink, inaugurate officially, and probably what are we expecting to experience now?
It was a very plain motive. We passed between 2010 and 2015 a very severe economic and financial crisis. You know, in 2008 there was that huge world crisis, the Lehman Brothers failure, and then the crisis of the sovereign debts in Europe, and Portugal was hit in a very hard way by the crisis, and we had to take some difficult decisions to suspend some of our offices abroad. Now the crisis is over, we overcome the crisis, so there is no reason to not reestablish the relations with our friendly friends from Kenya.
Like Kenya.
Yes, on the grounds that they merit.
Yes. So today is a big day, definitely. So what do you expect today?
Well, I expect to see my compatriots. I expect to speak with them. I already had a breakfast with some members of the Portuguese business community here. I gave a lecture in the University of Nairobi to students of political science, international relations, and Portuguese studies. Yesterday I met other Portuguese actors, protagonists here. So it is very, very important for us. You know that there is about 1,000 Portuguese living here in Kenya, mainly in this area between Nairobi and Mombasa. We have a tradition, an historical tradition of contact with Kenyans. Our relations are in a good shape. We count with the visit of your president next June to Portugal. The two presidents met in September in New York at the margins of the General Assembly of the United Nations. So you see that there are close links between us, and of course we have to cultivate our links.
Thank you very much. That is Santos Silva, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Portugal, His Excellency Santos. Thank you very much for having time with us.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, thank you. That is His Excellency Santos Silva, Foreign Affairs Minister for Portugal, speaking of great things that are in store for both Kenya and Portugal, trying to move forward the relationships and the common grounds in terms of culture between Kenya and Portugal to economic mutual benefit between the two countries. I'm Lofty Matambo from the Portuguese Embassy. Back to